All right, well, welcome everyone. The title of this talk is LA, How Liberalism Got Us into This Hell and How to Fight Back. And it's based on a document I wrote that's printed in the current issue of Workers' Vanguard, which I encourage everyone here to read if you haven't already. So maybe a first question is, what do we mean by liberalism? So liberalism has been the dominant ruling class ideology in this country since the 1990s and since the overturn of the Soviet Union and the declaration of the, quote, end of history and death of communism. And liberal capitalism was, proclaimed the high point of human civilization, which was destined to spread around the entire world. And there was a very real extension of imperialist capital around the world. This liberal triumphalism was the ideological justification for that process. The nation state was said to be a thing of the past. Free trade, open capital markets, and high levels of immigration were seen as the road toward progress and world peace. But these principles reflected the specific interests of the ruling class and were used to, in fact, trample on the national rights of oppressed countries, to deindustrialize the West, import cheap labor, and open markets to imperialist capital and goods, i.e. globalization. So liberalism really is the use of, quote, progressive ideas by the ruling class to advance its own interests at the expense of the working class. So internationally and here, this both elicited anger from those who were trampled and ruined and subsequently moved right in reaction to this, and because there was also no working class alternative to liberalism. And it also caused a crisis for the US imperialists by hollowing out their industry, which is a basic thing you need to maintain itself as a dominant world power. So this is why today the liberal status quo is really being destroyed and replaced by rightward reaction. And for decades, Los Angeles itself has been ruled by liberal Democratic Party politicians that embraced, enlightened views on social issues as they, in alliance with the country's capitalists, fucked the working class by offshoring vast areas of industry and leaving the LA region deindustrialized, gutting trade unions, and devastating working class communities here. So Los Angeles was, really fundamentally transformed, from the 70s to the early 90s. Deindustrialization happened, early on here, starting in the 70s. You had a number of industries that were closed and replaced with service and tech jobs and an expanding entertainment industry, i.e. Hollywood. The city's Black population was devastated amid a huge demographic shift, which was fueled by immigration of mostly Mexicans, but also Central Americans. And this immigration was directly caused by US domination and subjugation of those countries, which heavily intensified in this period as well. So in the 1980s, Reaganism reigned supreme. In 81, Reagan dealt a decisive defeat to the US working class by crushing the PATCO air traffic controller strike. This was followed by years of plant closures, which wiped out decent paying union jobs in LA and beyond. A 1991 LA Times article on the area's auto manufacturing facilities noted that once upon a time in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they cut an imposing swath through the heart of LA County. There was the Chrysler plant in the City of Commerce, the Ford plant in Pico Rivera, the General Motors plant in Southgate and Van Nuys, the Studebaker plant in Vernon, the Nash plant in El Segundo, the Willys Overland plant in Maywood. When GM announced the closure of its Van Nuys plant Friday, it snuffed out the last glimpse of an era in which 15,000 or more LA auto workers put together 500,000 cars in a single year. So LA County was the second largest automaking center in the nation after Detroit. And lots of other, industrial jobs were also decimated. And many of these jobs went overseas or to cheaper non-union regions in the South or the Southwest. And I cite this because if you grow up in LA today, you would have no idea that there was once so much industry and that much of it was union. And it was these industrial jobs that really impelled many Black people to migrate to LA largely from the South. And, the city's Black population surged during World War II and the post-war period. And by 1970 had reached almost 500,000, which was the largest, Black population in California. Because the vast majority of the city was off limits to Black people, as it was, to most Latinos, Black neighborhoods, rose up in proximity to the old barrios. And this is really where you have both the origin, the seed of the competition for scarce resources, but also, the start of cultural exchange, like lowrider culture, and of course, oldies but goodies. But housing was, it was, segregated in Los Angeles. And in 1964, California passed Prop 14, which, literally enshrined the ability of homeowners to deny sales based on race. And at this point, Latinos were a similarly sized demographic, but older than the Black population here. And, some Latino groups organized against Prop 14 on the basis that this was their fight too, and that like Black people, they wanted equality in housing as well. But other Latinos who had progressed, a little more towards assimilation viewed anti-Black racism as not their problem. And, while this proposition was overturned by the Supreme Court in '67, it really codified, this practice in LA, since then, whether it was legally sanctioned or not. And, so for LA, liberalism really has meant putting a gloss on LA as this multiracial mecca, when in reality, it's very segregated. And LA schools were also, and still are, segregated. In parts of South LA that were, overwhelmingly white at that time and working class, like Southgate, schools were 100% white. Black youth who lived right near Southgate had to attend schools like way farther away that were 99% Black. In 1976, the California Supreme Court ruled that LA had to integrate its schools. And for 3 years, busing was implemented here. And the loudest voices against this were white parents in the San Fernando Valley who did not want their kids being bused. But Latinos were also mobilized against busing in the name of defense of bilingual education. And so while Latinos did not have much voting weight at that time, they were cynically used to claim that the white liberals weren't racist. And so what was the result? Black kids didn't get integrated education, Latinos did not get bilingual education, and schools in California today are more segregated than ever. So in 1979, Prop 1 overturned busing. And so, these liberal integration plans really, they were really designed to fail and elicit backlash because the resources weren't being increased. So what was being increased was the competition over fewer, slots and crumbs. And so, and then there was also a lot of white flight. So what was set up after busing was the magnet system that was, set up as like an answer to that, but it really just provided very minimal integration to, again, cover up an entrenched, system of entrenched school segregation. So I grew up in LA in the 80s and 90s, at which point then the public schools were 18% white. I think today they're only 10% white. And most of these, most of those white kids if they went to public school, they went to these better funded magnet programs that had racial quotas. And the high school I went to had 2 magnet programs, which were integrated, but they were like only a few hundred students. And the rest of the school was a quote original school, which had like 2,000 students, and it was all Latino and Black and some Filipino students. And today, the LA school district is like 75% Latino, and many kids go to schools that are almost 100% Latino. So back to the impact of deindustrialization. So in the 70s, manufacturing was the top employer of Black workers in LA, and many belonged to unions and earned decent wages. Janitorial and hotel work were mostly Black union jobs, as was the postal service. And so deindustrialization really forced most Black workers who stayed in LA to take low-wage service jobs. And then they had to compete for these jobs with the rapidly increasing Latino immigrant population. And so all of this, has ramifications for today. Black people are 8% of LA residents, but make up 42% of the homeless. In California as a whole, 28% of male prisoners are Black, even though only 6% of the state's adult male population is Black. And so by the 80s, the historic core of working class Black LA, South Central, Compton, is changing. And, again, immigrants from Mexico and Central America were moving in, mainly because traditional areas were overflowing and they couldn't move into white areas. And at the same time, a lot of Black people who could left the city. The decimation of jobs, together with Reagan's austerity measures, the racist war on drugs, brought intensified ghettoization and increase in gangs, drugs, and racist police terror and occupation. So this is like the golden age of gangster rap, Eazy-E, NWA, but what did that reflect? It really reflected the worsening state of Black LA. And it was also the beginning of mass incarceration, which, vastly accelerated under Clinton's 94 crime bill. So the 1992 LA upheaval following the acquittal of the cops who beat Rodney King was not just an outpouring against rampant police brutality in the ghettos, which were then half Latino, half Black, but really also the wretched living conditions and job prospects that went back to deindustrialization. So just to give you some demographics that really show, how the city changed. So LA's Latino residents numbered 422,000 in 1970, 820,000 in 1980, and 1.4 million in 1990. And by 2020, almost 2 million Latinos lived in the city. In comparison, the slightly larger Black population in 1970 of 490,000 barely ticked up to 500,000 a decade later, and by 2020, that figure dropped to 335,000. The white population was always the majority in LA until the 90s. Today, there's 1.3 million. And of course, there's also a sizable Asian population, which is 12% of the city. And so the document that I wrote is also critical of our own party's inability to deal with what was happening at this time. We couldn't deal with the major developments of what was really a contradictory period in the 80s. You have the anti-Soviet Cold War reaction, but it's combined also with a rising neoliberalism. And so we defended the Soviet Union and fought imperialism, brought it at home, which came down very hard and at key points on Black people, immigrants. And we obviously knew there was a large increase in immigration, but our reaction was really kind of to cling to a liberal moralism as opposed to basing ourselves in a Marxist understanding of the objective reality and what tasks flow from that. And so despite the growth of the Latino population, we denied that lasting demographic change was underway, and we projected both mass deportations and mass assimilation of Latinos along racial, Black-white lines. And it was as if, factoring in the increasing weight of the Latino working class into our tasks and what we were supposed to do would, somehow negate, the centrality of the fight for Black liberation to the American Revolution. And, the truth is the opposite, that to liberate Latinos from their exploitation and oppression means fighting against Black oppression, which is the key tool used by the ruling class to weaken and divide the working class. And I think if you study the history of working class struggle in LA, you will see this very clearly. So the refusal to take into account this changing reality, I think, left many of our comrades adrift in this period. And, the framework for understanding what was happening is laid out in our theoretical journal, Spartacist, number 68, which I encourage people to read as well if they want to really understand what are the processes happening today. But in it, we state that a party that claims to be Marxist but does not have a correct political and economic appreciation of the period cannot guide the working class in line with its class interests. And so if you don't have a materialist grounding based on concrete reality as it's developing, then the tasks you're going to set for yourselves and for the working class are going to reflect actually interests of other classes. And I think this helps explain, why our party, but honestly, the left in LA in general has really been mired in, capitulating to liberalism. And I think that, the key task that was posed for us, that in order to advance the fight for the working class and oppressed, there had to be a break with this liberal framework. And, again, the whole left, this was posed. And I think the basic point in the recent decades in LA, right, is that you cannot advance anything in alliance with the source of the immiseration of the working people and oppressed of the city. Like, it's not possible. So, in the 80s, we could obviously recognize the growing importance of Latinos in the United States, but we also said Latinos will become assimilated mainly to whites. As with every new wave of immigrants, the first wave faces brutal conditions, in this case, particularly super exploitation growing out of undocumented workers' lack of legal rights. But that's not what happened. I think people who know LA know that. Whatever the similarities among, first waves of immigrants, Mexican and Central American immigrants, like overall experiences really differed from those of, pre-1920 Italian and Irish immigrants, for a key reason. Their home countries are in the backyard and oppressed by racist US imperialism. And, another key factor is a difference in the period. Like prior to 1920, US imperialism is on the rise and the industrial base is growing. By the 70s and 80s, US imperialism is in decline. You have globalization, deindustrialization, and that meant there really wasn't much of a ladder to climb up. So you have decades of continuous waves of Latino immigration in an extended period of relative stability. And, and it is common for earlier generations to oppose the next wave, which the ruling class uses as scab labor and to undercut organizing. We've seen this plenty in the history of California. Being undocumented in huge numbers, which is also something never faced by European immigrants, also impacts, prospects for assimilation. And, in LA, while there's, a number of Latinos who, quote, made it, the vast majority have not. And, most Latinos are segregated in the worst schools and neighborhoods at a time when, conditions have been worsening for the working class as a whole. Also, Latinos are 80% working class. And, this is true for white workers, too. You don't just get out of the class you're born into. And that's also, partly due to, obviously, discrimination in the case of Latinos. So the answer, the question, like, how do you fight the oppression of Latinos is actually not so different from how do you fight Black oppression. You do have to fight for multiracial unity, but it has to be based on shared material interests against the bosses and the liberals who pit one group against the other in a race to the bottom. It's not in the interest of white workers to have a layer of Black workers below them, because that brings down everyone's wages. And this is also true in the relationship between US-born workers and undocumented immigrants. So there's an example, in the 80s when unionized Black janitors were being laid off and replaced by non-union immigrant labor at dramatically reduced pay. And so what was the answer to that? Well, there needed to be a citywide janitor strike to defend Black workers' livelihoods and also organize immigrants into the union at the same pay. But to my knowledge, no one put forward a program, to fight along those lines. Instead, what we did, and a lot of the left still does today, is, approach the divisions between immigrants and Black people by, basically arguing that they have to overcome mutual prejudices against each other. And, which is really a completely liberal approach. American Trotskyist Richard Fraser captured this in describing, what the heart of white liberalism is. And he said, quote, "When applied to the Negro question, the theory of morality means that the root of the problem of discrimination and white supremacy is prejudice. This is the reigning theory of American liberalism and is the means by which the capitalists throw the responsibility for the Jim Crow system upon the population as a whole. If people weren't prejudiced, there would be no Negro problem. This contention is fundamentally false." A liberal argument, used to push, the quote, melting pot American dream lie is that unlike Black people, Latino immigrants work hard and will do jobs Black people won't do. I always heard this growing up in LA, but what is behind this argument? This is an argument for super exploitation of immigrant labor. That is what the liberal capitalist rulers have cared most about. It is not about loving and praising immigrants, and it never has been. The ruling class saw super exploitation of immigrants as essential to the neoliberal order that was emerging, in the 70s. The door to mass increase in immigration was opened by the 1965 immigration bill, which came out of the civil rights movement and got rid of racist quotas that had been in place since the 1920s. But importantly, the neoliberals wanted mass undocumented immigration. Milton Friedman, who was one of the fathers of neoliberalism and crafted brutal imperialist, shock therapy in Latin America, gave this neoliberal argument for this in his lecture in 1978, What is America? He said, as long as Mexican immigration is illegal, the people who come in do not qualify for welfare. They don't qualify for Social Security. They don't qualify for all the other myriads of benefits. And as long as they don't qualify, they migrate to jobs. They provide employers with workers of a kind they cannot get. And today, this is actually the main, one of the main arguments liberals use against Trump. You can't deport all the immigrants who will do these jobs. And right before the election, J.D. Vance was asked by a liberal New York Times reporter, so how do you propose to build all the housing necessary that we need in this country by removing all the people who are working in construction? And Vance responded, well, you could re-engage folks into the American labor market. People say, well, Americans won't do those jobs. Americans will do those jobs, but at certain wages. And, that's like actually an effective argument that appeals to non-native born workers, even though it's a lie that Vance and Trump are going to create well-paying construction jobs. So, but the purpose of what they're really doing is to instill like constant fear in a layer of workers, which is going to hurt the ability of the working class as a whole to fight the boss's attacks. And, we see that in LA right now. So in neoliberalism's heyday, our party also projected that Reagan was going to carry out mass deportations. In response to his 1986 immigration bill, which definitely had plenty of nasty provisions, our newspaper said that, this is just preparation for the avalanche of up to 2 million deportations this new law is expected to touch off. But, as far as I can tell, there were no mass deportations that year. And today, the bill is remembered for having granted amnesty to 3 million immigrants. And the last time that happened that's the last time that has happened in the U.S. There's this funny show called This Fool, and it's about a Mexican family in South LA, and the mother has like this huge picture of Reagan in her living room, which her son can't stand, but she saw him as the person who gave her, amnesty, gave her papers. So, at the same time, this is when the militarization of the border begins. And so previously, immigrants could really go back and forth between Mexico and the US like very easily. But now, many undocumented became trapped for fear of not getting back in. So, in this period between 1980 and 2000, the Mexican immigrant population goes from 2.1 million to 9.2 million. And before Clinton was elected president in 1992, Republicans won the state of California in nearly every presidential election dating back to 1952. And since Clinton's election, California has been a liberal Democratic Party stronghold. And under Clinton, there was again significant growth in international trade, massive offshoring of production, and explosion of international capital circulation, i.e., like globalization. But Clinton gave this like profound shift a social liberal cover to it. As I mentioned in the beginning of this talk, the US and its allies ruled the world in the name of liberal principles like freedom and democracy, defense of the defenseless. And California, in particular, LA, too, were key to this new world order. In the early 90s, Latinos had surpassed whites as LA's largest, racial ethnic group. And in that decade, Latino immigrants, in the city really started increasing their organizing against the abysmal conditions. Some of you may remember the Justice for Janitors campaign and the strikes at that time. And at that time, we argued that the answer to anti-foreigner racism will come from united working class struggle. But economic struggle alone cannot in itself overcome the deep racial and ethnic divisions in the class. To accomplish that really means we're building a new leadership of the unions, class struggle leadership that's going to oppose the trade union bureaucrats who really, fuel these divisions. And this is important today because there's a lot of, socialist groups that everyone, united struggle, we're all united. And of course we need united struggle, but how do you get that? How do you actually take on these deep divisions, and deal with, show how liberalism actually fuels them? And so you have to show why it's in the class interest to have unity, not just like shaming liberal moral arguments that only, continue to divide the class. So example, like in 1994, Republican Governor Pete Wilson, pushed Prop 187, which, was to deny services like public education to immigrants. And the campaign appealed like very hard for Black residents for support of it. But the liberal leadership of the anti-Prop 187 movement was also breeding division and was also, dangerous to Black people and Latinos. Again, this is kind of the theme here, right? It wasn't possible to make any headway in the fight for improved conditions for the oppressed in alliance with the liberal forces that were responsible for gutting education and social services in the name of, those same enlightened values. And so, the capitalists, they pit one section of the working class against another to weaken its struggles and obscure that they themselves are the real enemy. So Black parents in LA at this time, they had legitimate grievances regarding their kids' education, even while bilingual education had suddenly become the main need of most students in the neighborhood schools. And so to counter the channeling of that anger in a right-wing directions, socialists needed to fight against these divisive liberal schemes and for more resources for quality, integrated bilingual education and at the boss's expense. And instead, you ended up having a situation where a majority of Black voters did support Prop 187. It passed, but then I think it was ultimately blocked by the courts. But on the other hand, too, just declaring that the Democrats are the same as the Republicans and they're both equally anti-immigrant, which we and other, socialists have argued at the time, is abstractly too, but it's abstractly true, but it doesn't actually take on liberalism's, pro-immigrant posture. And, so the opposition to Pete Wilson really helped activate California's, rapidly growing Latino population and turn them against the Republicans. Clinton's motto was a new covenant with the American people. His gutting of welfare was couched as empowering the poor and expanding the middle class. And his 1996 platform said that a Republican effort to bar the children of illegal immigrants from schools was wrong. So, in LA, we needed to fight for Black, white, and Latino working class unity in explicit opposition to this liberal democratic unity that was supporting this new status quo. And instead, we basically denied that Black people's grievances, were just, and implicitly attributing that those grievances were, due to just anti-immigrant backwardness. We also lectured Latinos that the color line has always been the central strategic question in the US. This is true, but we failed to address why the fight against Black oppression was their fight too. Latinos and Black people have been and continue to be pitted against each other for jobs, education, and housing. These divisions can only be overcome by motivating their shared material interests in joint class struggle against the capitalists and US imperialism. It will not be overcome by moral browbeating. So there was a short-lived sense of unity between Black people and Latinos during the 92 riots, but that did not, it was short-lived. It did not survive the suppression of the upheaval. And in response, you had a lot of Black and Latino community leaders in South LA, like Karen Bass, the current mayor, and that's how she and others earned their spurs, pushing Black-brown unity behind Democratic Party liberalism. And the claim was that such multi-class coalitions, linked to the city's rulers would, quote, uplift all of us. And so Black people and Latinos were still competing for resources, but it was done under the veneer of multiracial unity. And this liberal model wasn't new, it just reflected the changed demographic. So Tom Bradley, who was LA's first Black mayor from 1973 to 93, I think they didn't have term limits back then, I think it was like 20 years he was mayor, but he initiated a coalition of Black Angelenos together with representatives of the liberal Jewish community, growing Latino and Asian populations, and the unions. So in 2006, during the Bush Jr. years and in the lead up to Obama's election, there were massive protests in LA for immigrant rights, over 1 million in the streets on May Day. And at this point, we were really forced to deal with the changed demographics, but we never dealt with why our predictions did not happen the way we had said they would. And, these demonstrations were like classic Popular Front movement of immigrant rights groups, liberal politicians, labor, and the left. And we recognized that Democrats headed the movement, but we never fought to split it along class lines and provide revolutionary leadership to the immigrant rights struggle, and neither did the so-called, any other of the socialist left. Our critiques against the left at the time were not based on their alliance with the liberals, but on the scope of their demands. They called for amnesty, we called for full citizenship rights. And similar to the Black Lives Matter movement, the immigrant rights movement had an underlying contradiction. There was an enormous desire to improve the status of immigrants, many who have worked for decades without papers. But to truly achieve that requires confronting the interests of the ruling class, which gets massive profits from the super exploitation of the undocumented. And that's why the movement's bourgeois liberal program could only lead to defeat for the Latino working masses. Today, the left, like constantly harkens back to these protests as the model to repeat. And this is really bankrupt. It's like, what is it? First time tragedy, second time farce. Only shortly before these protests, LA elected its first Latino mayor, Antonio Villaraigosa. He was a UTLA teachers union organizer who placed himself in the tradition of Bradley's multiracial coalition. The mayor, as well as the head of the LA County Federation of Labor, Maria Elena Durazo, they were both prominent in these immigrant rights protests. They also both campaigned and worked for Obama, who after the 2008 economic crisis became notorious as the biggest ever deporter-in-chief with over 3 million deported. So the Democrats, for years promised immigration reform, but undocumented Latino immigrants and their children got no real status and no economic ladder to climb, while living and working conditions, just deteriorated. And this is really this betrayal really led many to support Trump in 2016 and even more to do so in the last election. So Mayor Bass's election in 2022 was seen as this like culmination of decades of LA's liberal black-brown coalition building. And like Brandon Johnson, who was elected, Chicago mayor at the same time, she got her support from, progressive Black and Latino activists as well as, labor in the city. And a month before the mayoral election, there was a recording that was leaked of a prominent Latino members of LA City Council and the Latino head of the LA Federation. That was, the leaked recording, they were discussing strategies for how to use the city's redistricting process to maximize Latino political power and dilute the power of Black voters. And Nuri Martinez, who was then the head of the city council, she was caught on this recording spewing racist crap against the city's Oaxacan, indigenous, and Black communities. And so NPR noted at the time, what Nuri Martinez was heard saying on this leaked tape was just about the worst things you could say as a politician in a city like LA, where cross-racial coalitions are so important in politics. Erica Smith, a Black columnist for the LA Times, wrote that the substance of the recording confirms, quote, the worst fears of many Black Angelenos that Latino politicians treat political power as a zero-sum game. That's because of their numbers, that because of their numbers, they will take over leadership of the city, and because of their racist beliefs, they will ignore our needs. So Smith concluded that the incident had really shattered the popular narrative of LA, of being, quote, multicultural Mecca where Black and brown people build alliances to work together. But what the recordings, really captured was that lurking beneath the multiracial veneer is the vicious competition over shrinking resources inherent to the decaying U.S. capitalism. So what does LA's Black population need? It really the same things as Latino and other working masses: reindustrialization, union jobs, decent integrated housing, education near where they work, and free quality health care. And the only way to get anything for Black, brown, and working class LA is to wage integrated class struggle against Karen Bass and the capitalist interests she represents. This requires a break with the liberal forces that are overseeing the devastation of our class. And so, this liberal multiracial coalition really paved the way for the current polarizations and rising reaction, which, drove both, a lot of Black people and a lot of Latinos towards Trump. When running for mayor, Bass, would refer to the decades of progress since the 90s when things were so bad and how all that was under threat now. And her community coalition, claimed to, unite the voices of Black, brown, indigenous, and people of color to bring about social change together, to dismantle systemic racism and economic inequity. But racist oppression and economic inequity have only gotten worse in LA. A 2016 research paper called The Color of Wealth in LA noted that Black and Mexican households have 1% of the wealth of white households, or like 1 cent for every dollar. At the same time, you have, a gentrification of the barrios. Between, like Boyle Heights, between 2010 and 2016, the median monthly rent, jumped from $1,500 to $2,200. I think today it's like $2,500. And you had a situation where actual mariachis were evicted from a building that was renamed Mariachi Crossing for the explicit reason of making way for wealthier, tenants. So, I mean, I think that kind of captures like the liberal, the liberal like LA question. So the DSA LA, Democratic Socialist America LA. So they currently have 4 elected Democrats on the city council, so 1/4 of the seats. And they put out a program for LA in 2022 that, was interesting. It correctly noted that in the early 90s, a, quote, multiracial coalition cohered to challenge the Republican stronghold on politics and reinvigorate the stagnant Democratic Party establishment that managed the interests of a different faction, primarily business and real estate within California's capitalist class. They also observed that the dominant power structure within LA County can be described as a status quo coalition, which invokes, quote, progressive language while espousing neoliberal policies and views, which kind of sounds like what I've been saying, in this presentation. But then what do they propose to do? Basically to rebuild the very alliance with liberalism that has so clearly screwed Los Angeles, and that's what their electeds do in LA now. So they essentially, the document goes on to argue for a new multiracial coalition, but with better liberal forces, to push, liberal reform. And while the program also conveniently doesn't mention Karen Bass at all, again, this is 2022 when she got elected. And they say that this coalition is not a single unified power and that building an alternative to status quo coalition will require winning over some elements of the coalition. What they're saying is that you have to break the liberal, progressives away from the particularly hated Democrats in the city, like the ones on the leaked recording. So the upshot here is that they basically grossly give a, quote, socialist cover to the worsening situation in LA. One of their city council electeds, Eunice Hernandez, she tried to sell out her constituents who organized a tenants union and had been on rent strike for almost 5 years, making a deal that favored the landlords at the expense of the tenants. The group of local DSA electeds also includes the infamous Nietzsche Rahman, who is a Zionist supporter of genocide, whom the DSA LA endorsed despite that and based on her, quote, fight for housing. She also voted for Mayor Bass's new racist police chief, despite DSA LA's call on Bass to reject that nomination. Another elected on city council, Hugo Soto Martinez, puts forward, useless legislation in response to deportations, like requiring businesses to report ICE actions, like the bosses who profit from super exploitations are going to be the ones to protect immigrants now. And recently, Soto said, I support the mayor and her reelect, and I think her roots from community organizing is something we need right now. While Eunice Hernandez said she's moving how she needs to move and has been doing a good job, at least in handling the crisis we're in right now. And this is as, Bass's cops have, colluded with ICE to repress the protests against it. So both the DSA electeds and much of the left blame racism and the rise of reaction on Trumpism. But what this really does is obscure that liberalism has been at the root of the problem and responsible for many years of attacks and betrayals. Trump's second election really reflected the death of liberalism as US imperialism's dominant ideology. And this liberal, multiracial coalition was really given a hammer blow by Trump, who boasts of having won almost half the total Latino vote in the last election and increased share of the Black vote. There's a book from last year, from 2024, that tries to deal with the rightward shift of Latinos. It's by a liberal journalist, Paola Ramos. She was also, she was also the director for Hispanic media for Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign. So her book is not called Deplorables. Her book is called Defectors. And, her book, she's trying to understand why so many Latinos went to Trump. But, as a liberal, she can only conceive of it as entrenched backward ideas, religion, internalized oppression. And her answer is you have to liberate, quote, haunted minds. And of course, these things, there are factors, but these ideas, one, have been around, for a long time. But why has there been such a shift? And, why do many Latinos who voted for Obama, in previous elections then vote for Trump? And so you really have to look at the material conditions. You have to look at, places, look at South Texas, look at New Mexico, look at the Imperial Valley in California. Like, despite decades of Democratic Party promises, for immigration reform, it's gotten worse. The material conditions have gotten worse. People are still vulnerable, without citizenship, and then others who have, status and can vote, they see like growing instability, they see inflation, and they see that as, threats to their, what little they have. And they also see newer immigrants as also as, threats to that. And so just saying, well, fuck Latino Trump supporters, they're, not raza anymore, they defected from their people, is actually just democratic, it's liberal democratic politics. And we have to provide a working class alternative to both wings of the exploiting class. And if you don't do that, you're never going to win the Latino working class. And if you don't win that, how are you going to make a socialist revolution in this country? So, for the workers' movement to just kind of continue on these decades-old failed course of political blocks with liberals only ensures that there will be no actual fight to, make LA for the working people, which is what the DSA claims to stand for. And it means there's not going to be any real fight to defend immigrants and no fight for Black and brown liberation. So our task in LA really and nationally is to bridge this huge gap between the left and Black, Latino, and immigrant working masses by showing that their struggles are connected to the immediate and historic interests of all workers. And so the last few months, we've seen ICE rampage in the city, push mass fear, in the city that La Raza built. And there have been, initially there were some militant protests here. They were viciously repressed. And the left in LA, which was never very influential to begin with, is seen by many workers as either like totally irrelevant or as, liberal sellouts. So the central task, for the left and our party is to overcome this divide, in order to guide the desperately needed defensive struggles today. So hopefully by laying out the lessons of the past decades, which is what I've tried to do here, this will help us to intervene into the struggle today. And the United Front demo last week for Sean and Jaime, who are union bus drivers that were gone after for putting forward defense of their majority immigrant passengers, is a small example of what is necessary, which was spoken to earlier. This is how to fight back, right? The situation is dire. There's little organized labor struggle. The dominant mood in the working class is a lot of fear, apathy, or really just, and despair. And so the only strategy that can win is one that relies on the workers themselves taking matters into their own hands, in their own defense against these attacks that are happening and are coming. So anything else really is just going to lead to working people and the oppressed getting further crushed in this city. And we can't let that happen. We can't just keep doing the same failed politics. We need to have debates in the left and in the unions on how do we go forward, how do we strengthen and unite the working class so that we can actually advance our interests. So I'll leave it at that.